day, everyone. This is Channel Planners in a Pod with your host, Tashil Vala. And this is episode 2, where I will be looking at specifically at informality impacting the urban environment in terms of street trading and how urban identity can be retained by using spatial planning tools. So, what I want to uncover in this episode is specifically looking at context and objectives. So unpacking this, I want to look at informality relating to context and breaking it down and the issues in the city of Johannesburg. It's the objective how urban identity can be retained by using spatial planning tools in order to deal with these issues that represents informality.
Good day, everyone. Today I'm speaking to honors graduate Tahmid Khan and Yuri Olifants. We are going to be looking at the interplay between spatial planning, informality, and urban management. Specifically, we are looking at the city of Johannesburg to get an understanding. Right. So, my first question to you both is that how has informality impacted the surrounding urban environment based on street trading?
Okay, so I'll go first. So how it impacted the surrounding, especially people, is that firstly, based on the research that I've done in Kliptown last year, I found out that people or traders specifically are able to take things into their own hands, or rather take their own economic responsibility into their own hands by doing informal activities. However, they do not enjoy the luxury of the legal framework. But then, in turn, this allows them to become economically independent in a sense, and also allows them to embrace their democratic right to, having a place to work. But then, another positive thing that it does for people is that, especially in townships, so informal enterprises in townships allow people, or give the opportunity to people within the township to have access to products and materials that they wouldn't have access to without the informal settlement. So they don't have to travel long distances, and they don't have to go to certain places to get products and materials. So then the convenient local spaza at the corner is the best, place for them to go to get their stuff. So that's one way that informal enterprises get encouraged, or, further impact positively other people or their surroundings. But then one negative thing is that we do not have, or rather the state does not have control over the products, and also the way in which they sell products. So then one thing is that this gives opportunity for for criminal activity to happen. But one thing also is that some of the informal activities that do happen usually happen outside of, legislative planning. So then now, if a legislation or policy plans for certain city to be in one way, or framework in general plans for city to work and do something in one way, and people decide out of need to become or to perform informal activities, what happens is that it disrupts the original plan of the policy. So an example is can be framework set up in order to ensure that certain people got certain employment stores or shops. So then what happens is that we see a lot of this in town, where people end up building informal structures in front of the shop in order for them to have access to the informal economy. So one thing it does, it blocks the entire pavement. It blocks the entire pavement, and thus, makes it less easier for people to walk on the pavement, and also makes it less, desirable for people to be in the space, because the whole pedestrian flow of the area is already constrained. So that's my answer to the first question.
Okay. So Tahmid, how would you add on to this question?
Okay.
Right. Good evening, listeners. I would like to answer the question, how does informality impact on its surrounding environment, particularly based on street trading, right? So, just to add on to what Yuri has been saying, I agree with all the elements and concepts that he's brought up and the findings from his research. And let's go back to the beginning where we discussed the concept of informality. So informality is quite complex and is prevalent in the global south, including our country of South Africa. It can be loosely defined as the operational system that strays away from governance, rules, regulations, and the formal umbrella as a whole. The environment also plays a significant role upon informality, and so does informality affect the environment with the same magnitude. So now I would like to discuss the inherent impact of informality upon the environment, particularly taking into account informal markets. One can say that there are many intrinsic pros and cons concerning informality. Concerning the pros, the most obvious thing that can be noticed, well, according to me, is the facilitation of income and livelihood generation for people, like Yuri was saying. And this particularly assists the vulnerable groups such as the poor, who may find it difficult to navigate the channels of formal livelihood generation. Another pro that I've seen, which is perhaps more specifically which is more environmentally specific, has been the principles of Ian Bentley from his book Responsive Environments. From these principles, informality can provide a space or environment with the following concepts. The first one I'd like to discuss is variety. So now variety is known as the quality or condition of an environment being extraordinary or diverse. Informality facilitates this by bringing people together who use and interact with the space and bring about a sense of uniqueness to it by the different activities that occur on it. This obviously varies in each environment as they and the activities that occur on them are not the same. Informal markets environments are not governed by the channels of bureaucracy, like Yuri was saying, that the state has little to no control over them. Thus, the levels of variety are not controlled, and each environment varies differently in its elements. If we look at an environment that is dominant in informal markets, such as street traders, we can see the variety through different stalls, different items being sold, different people, different activities on the space, etc. These elements combined provide the site with a rich mix of perceptual conception, or in other words, richness, which is the second concept. This is defined as the quality of an environment that has a lot of different features or aspects. This ties in with the concept of variety and provides the space with uniqueness and flair. The third concept brought about by informality, particularly street markets, is visual appropriateness. This can either be a pro or a con, depending on the context. Visual appropriateness is significant in the places which are most likely to be visited by people from a wider range and variety of backgrounds, particularly when the appearance can't be altered by the users themselves. So far as social space is concerned, where street markets are located, it is relevant to the outside of buildings which divide the public realm. Informal markets are usually a hustle and bustle of activities, stalls, and people in an informal setting, usually. These spaces are usually along pavements and streets, which is undesirable in the grander scheme of things, as pavements are usually meant for walking and are thus not very large sometimes. The presence of street markets sometimes obstructs walkways and results in poor legibility and visual appropriateness of the area. Now, moving to the cons of the informality upon an environment, street markets are informal and thus unregulated. This means that they're often not protected by the channels of bureaucracy and governance, thus leaving them vulnerable. The example of this is that street traders are not provided safe or appropriate spaces to operate and facilitate their activities. They thereby have to resort to free public spaces such as walkways, pavements, taxi ranks, street corners, and other similar spaces. Although this is a good thing for the people, as the sellers can make an honest living and passers-by can purchase items much easier, in the urban grand scheme of things, the notion of street trading can be viewed as a necessary evil. People need to make a livelihood to feed their families, but often at the compromise and well-being of public spaces. Common issues can be the degradation and detriment of said spaces, as they aren't properly maintained by neither the traders nor the authorities and people that use the space, thus leading to urban and spatial issues such as poor legibility and poor visual appropriateness. In essence, street trading provides an area with an identity that's viewed as controversial due to the compounding of many socio-economic and spatial factors. Moving on to Tashil, back to you.
Yeah, so this really does give us an insight, and especially now it shows that the challenges that spatial planning happening, it really shows, because Yuri, you mentioned a lot about how there's this framework, there is legislations that are being implemented, but they're very more constrained. And then moving to Tahmid, you've talked about how urban identity through Bentley's principles are represented through these are represented. So it really does put a lot into perspective, and moving on to urban management and spatial planning, it really will link to the next question, which is how can the urban identity be retained by applying spatial planning tools? This would be with regards to looking at spatial development frameworks, looking at spatial theory. This could also be looking at the SPLUMA, Spatial Planning Land Use Management Scheme Act. So it's how would you guys answer that? Starting with Tahmid.
All right. Yes, I agree that spatial planning tools, they are very important in preserving the urban identity, and spatial planning tools protect various elements of urban identity such as the history, the culture, the architecture, and also the social interactions and people of a space. So here are some of the ways that I think spatial planning tools can help. You can use policy frameworks and legislation for historical and cultural conservation and preservation, so you can protect certain spaces from degradation and detriment. This includes public spaces where a lot of street trading occurs, and you can also, but you can, at the same time, to help the street traders, you can also promote mixed-use development and public space design and community participation to foster a middle ground to ensure that spaces are protected and safe, but at the same time the traders have a safe space to work on and their livelihoods are not snatched away from them, so to say. And yeah, I think adaptive reuse of spaces is also good, where spatial planning can encourage adaptive reuse of existing structures, repurposing of spaces that are not necessarily used as much to house the street traders, and also conserving the Ian Bentley's principles of concerning responsive environments, as these greatly impact upon how space is viewed or how good a space is. Yes, and overall, spatial planning tools can help retain urban identity, like we say, by protecting the different elements of it, and they can also be used to encourage sustainable development and design public spaces that reflect the unique character of the city, but at the same time protecting and preserving the livelihoods of street traders. Yes, that's all from me.
So before I move on to Yuri, so yes, I do agree that so we need to reflect a lot on our spatial development frameworks, and we need to see that when it comes to spatial, to retaining an urban identity, there's a lot of challenges. There's the focus point on looking at social development, the built form, and biodiversity. So it really shows these, when it comes to spatial planning, there's these objectives and contexts that we need to look at. But it also there's also it's the challenge of convincing others these spatial planning tools are crucial in our country. And if we think about it and link it to the city of Johannesburg, there's a lot of things that we need to consider of, and therefore looking at the urban identity, it really shows that spatial planning tools, there's constraints to it, but there's also a need for it. And especially when we come to informality and poor urban management, those spatial planning tools, despite how constrained it is, those are kind of the solutions that we need to look at. But moving on to Yuri, how would you answer this question on how urban identity be retained by applying spatial planning tools?
Oh, well, thank you, Spatial, and thank you, Tahmid, for your answer. I mean, it was really insightful. But just to add on to what Tahmid has said, so spatial identity has kind of also been retained through certain spatial development frameworks, such as the City of Johannesburg Spatial Development Framework. So then, one of the visions of this framework is to create a compact policy-centric city in order to create better economic opportunity and also advance economic opportunity within the metro. So, given this, the identity of Johannesburg has primarily been being the city of gold or the city of opportunity. So many people come from other provinces and other countries to Johannesburg specifically for economic opportunity and also to participate in the existing economic activity. So the spatial development framework of Johannesburg already caters for this by having visions such as this, that advance economic development, and also, other strategies such as the corridor of freedom. So that was actually meant to better advance, the economy of Johannesburg specifically, through the corridor, through having mixed use and also having linear transit along buildings of mixed use. So then that's one way that they have retained, or they have attempted to retain, the identity of economic opportunity of the city. And one of the other things is that the spatial development framework tries to provide accessibility to these economic activity through other strategies, which is something that is likely to retain the identity of the city. So that's already linking to how existing policies already cater for the retainment of the identity of an urban area or an urban city such as Johannesburg. However, one additional thing that can be done is that instead of just looking at one aspect of its identity, it should maybe attempt to look at other aspects of its identity. So then there are some identities that we would not try to retain, such as economic inequality. So that is an identity within Johannesburg. There's a lot of inequality, but then that's something that we would like to not retain. So then one thing that can be done is that we can look at the cultural trends or the identity trends such as this economic inequality, and then try to see how it benefits the people. So then, is it an identity that benefits the city itself, or does the city's identity need to change? So then that's one thing we should think about, especially when forming frameworks as planners. So then another thing is that one way to actually also encourage the good parts about an identity of a city or an area itself is by doing proper cultural analysis. So one thing that I saw lacking in some of the documents is, cultural analysis of an area. So now the culture of an area or of an urban space is going to determine the identity of it. So one thing that we can do is also find ways to translate that cultural analysis into a spatial framework that would encourage the good stuff about it. For example, one of the cultural identities of an area, such as Braamfontein, for example, is as a student hub, not only a student hub, but in a hub of creativity and also a hub of young people. So then one way, if that is a good thing that we'd like to see more of, we could also find ways to analyze it and translate that to create more of those hubs, or in advance that hub, which could better, it could better create more opportunities for creativity and also, expand on the good culture that is created in an area like Braamfontein. So yeah, that's basically it from me.
Thank you, Yuri. That was really, once again, linking to our spatial development framework. We've been looking at social development and its both form. Braamfontein really does represent a good idea, despite it also being mostly for students and accommodating students. There is that economic opportunities that have been in place. There is those economic opportunities that are active because students, mostly students can have access to those basic needs. So, and when it comes to looking at spatial development frameworks, the problem that Braamfontein could really be seen that's lacking is that it doesn't really consider its biodiversity. It's mostly looking at the city. And that's because it's looking at economic opportunities. So I do think this was a very insightful thing, and it just shows when it comes to spatial planning and using its tools such as spatial development frameworks, there are these limitations that do constrain a further practice when it comes to its plans. So this is very insightful on how you explained it. Is there any additions or anything you both would like to add, or a context, and how could we then create these challenges into an objective?
Like you said, the spatial development framework perhaps would contextualize and create these challenges into an objective to fix. But at the same time, I think a lot of people need to be educated about spatial planning tools, because we see that people want to create this perfect utopia that has no problems, but at the same time a lot of people wouldn't necessarily know how they can be achieved, and a lot of people are not aware of the urban planning profession and what we do, and so I think that we need to make an effort to educate people about spatial planning tools, and like I said before, have community participation programs that brings people together so that they can voice their opinions and how things should be done, and also at the same time they can learn about spatial planning and the tools and what's best for all parties involved. And yeah, that's my main concern, one of my main concerns actually, that people are not as educated or as aware of the spatial planning tools that we have in place, and policies and legislation and frameworks. they are mostly studied by bureaucratic entities and people like us who are professional. But the people who operate in the informal realm are not perhaps not as well versed in these documents and spatial planning tools. So we need to make an effort to rectify that. That's my opinion.
I couldn't agree furthermore. Yuri, anything you would like to add on from that statement Tahmid just said?
Well, I'd like to add on that aside from other people that are not planners being educated, I believe that us as planners also should try to exercise an urban mindset. So then what comes along with the urban mindset is by taking the rigidity of frameworks and policies and trying to apply them in a way that's more fluid and can be applied in a way that will not just be creating the same results as before, but in a way that can adapt to current problems. So, for example, we can take a framework that has been given already, and if there are some issues that are not being directly applied or directly addressed in the framework, how we can translate that into a way that allows the framework to work for other areas or other issues is by us using our urban mindset, by adapting some of the principles in a way that allows it to work for other areas or other issues that are not directly addressed in the framework. And yeah, I think planners should not just be robotic and keep consistently making the same kind of frameworks and also translating the same frameworks and creating the same type of urban space and battling with the same issues, but I think there should be some degree of leveling up when applying these frameworks. So at least that's the planner that I wish to become eventually. So one thing that planners can do is by constantly trying to learn how to better level up and see urban space as a whole and in its context.
Thank you very much. So as a conclusion, and that's something us all as planners and us that all studying urban and regional planning, is that these are the challenges planners have to face when it comes to these certain constraints. And that as a final thought, it's something that we all have to strive, and we should always strive on and try to convince stakeholders, to convince our government, to convince those who are in charge of policy making to implement and change. So as planners, the challenge is that we have to strive, and that's the option we have to take on. And going forward, the city of Johannesburg does face a lot of these challenges of not having proper implementations, but yet planners we strive and try to convince. So I just want to say thank you, Tahmid and Yuri, for your input, and thanks a lot for being part of my podcast.
Thanks for having
us.
Thanks for having us.
It was a pleasure to be part of this, and we wish you all the best.
Awinga.
episode, I will be speaking to a professional site planner relating data to how spatial planning tools facilitate urban management and informality to retain the urban identity around the city of Johannesburg. And I hope to hear from you on the next exciting episode on Planners in a Pod.